Ari Louis Show.
Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Ari Louis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. Thank you for joining us. We have a great program today. At any time, you can email the show at arilouisshow@hotmail.com, or you can email the station Israel Sports and News Radio at gmail.com. What is the latest with Israel Skeleton Racing? On the line right now, member of the national team. He's going to tell us about his training coming up and some tournaments as well. Mr. A.J. Edelman. A.J., welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Ari.
It's great to have you back, and we talked a few months ago with you, talk about some of the things coming up, and I understand that you're basically, this training coming up is very intense. You're going to be working with an Australian Olympic slider named John Farrow. Talk about how you got in touch with him and some of the training you plan on doing with him.
Sure. So I met John at my first competition in November of 2014. John, as you mentioned, is the Olympic slider for the Australian national team, and he had been with the Aussies down in Park City while I was taking my driver's school. At the time, I had no equipment with me. I was pretty much told by the Israel Bobsled and Skeleton Federation, you're going to a school. It happens next week. Pack your bags and go. So I headed down there without any equipment, any know-how. And John was very nice. He was nice enough to step up, and he heard that I was looking for spikes, which are the shoes that we run on the ice with. So I met John while looking for spikes, and ever since we've been quite good friends. So John has put together a camp for the Australian team, and I'll be joining them down in Park City for the next month. I'll join him beginning this weekend. And what we'll do is the most skeleton-specific training that we could do in the off-season is something called push training. And that means that at the beginning of our runs, usually, we sprint 30 to 40 meters before diving headfirst onto our sled. We can't replicate that completely, nor can we actually replicate the actual run in the off-season. But what we can do is go to a push track, which is outdoors. And that acts in a way in which we have essentially two train tracks, and we lay a sled across the train tracks on wheels, and then we push this sled for 30 to 40 meters and practice the same motions that we would on ice.
Okay, and the training is a big part of what you do, obviously, to be in top physical shape. And talk a little bit about the uniqueness of this type of training as opposed to training for other sports. Obviously, you played hockey at a collegiate level, and you've done other things. But this particular sport, talk about how it's unique in its training.
Sure. Well, skeleton is it's a highly specialized sport, but many of the athletes come from various other sporting backgrounds. A lot of them come from track and field backgrounds because of the necessity of quick agility and speed at the top of the run. But because skeleton is so highly specific in its own right for how people actually compete in it, and because half of the year you essentially can't do what's involved in the actual competition, a lot of the training is highly unique in that you're using Olympic weightlifting techniques. And Olympic weightlifting techniques are primarily geared towards developing explosiveness and force generation into the ground with your feet and with your hips. And so we use a lot of cleans, a lot of snatches, a lot of what you'll see with the lifting in the Summer Olympics to build up that force generation. Because for the most part, we're very limited in what we can actually do. We can't replicate a situation where we're on ice. So it all comes down to that 5 seconds or so, training for those 5 seconds or so at the top of the run without much regard in the physical training to what we'd be able to do in the other 55 seconds for which we'd be on the ice. So those 5 seconds at the top of the run are critical for us. And all of our training in the off-season, or the vast majority of the training in the off-season, is devoted towards cutting off fractions of a second in those 5 to 6 seconds at the top.
All right, now some other training you've been doing, this is some, I guess, more strength training. You worked with John Anderson, who's been known as the world's strongest man, and also Yasha Faye, who is Olympic lifter, and also Michael Bennett, who used to play in the National Football League. Talk about that training and how you got hooked up with those guys.
Right. So For most of my season, I was at the Calgary Canada Olympic Park, where I trained with a lot of excellent coaches and athletes alongside me. But as the season came to an end, I realized that going back to the Bay Area in California, I wouldn't really have access, or I would need to find access to other excellent coaching to propel me forward if I was going to make the improvements that I wanted to make over the course of the off season. And so Gage Galusha, who is from the U.S. bobsled program, who I met during my first driver's school in March of 2014 in Lake Placid, he recommended Yasha Fay, who is a former national level Olympic trainee in the U.S. program and has been Olympic lifting for over 25 years. He is based about 60 miles north of me and trains with, obviously, you just mentioned John Anderson. John Anderson has been known as the strongest man in the world. He's an IFBB pro competitive bodybuilder. And John is a very good friend of Michael Bennett, who's a former NFL running back. So in that one location, about 60 miles north of me, I was able to find 3 elite-level coaches to bring me to the next level. And Yasha has been an incredible asset in my training in bringing me from what would best be described as a very dirty form, clean and snatch, to helping me improve that over 40 kilos. That would be about 88 pounds over the course of only 2 months. And I credit most of my, if not almost the entirety of my success in those areas of those Olympic lifts to Yasha and to John, who have been so successful in training me in such a specialized environment.
Again, this is the Ari Louis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. We're talking to AJ Edelman of Israel Skeleton Racing. And let's talk a very interesting idea that's come up of a new suit that you've designed. It's going to incorporate your nickname, Hebrew Hammer, and the State of Israel on not just the flag, but the seal of the State of Israel. So talk a bit about that project and what you need from perhaps members of the audience to make that happen.
Right. So the suit, as well as the helmet that I wear, is something which is perhaps the number one most visible way to promote Israel in competition. Everybody, when I step up to the line, when I'm on the track, is going to see the white and blue and is going to see what goes on to the uniform and pay attention to the helmet and what's on the helmet. So a lot of people actually put designs on their helmets in levels of competition. Dave Grachechin in Canada has a very interesting bear on his helmet. Sungbin Yoon from Korea has Iron Man, as he's known as Iron Man, painted onto his helmet. I needed something for which on my equipment would be able to promote the idea that somebody who is Jewish, somebody who is representing the State of Israel, was competing in an Olympic winter sport, and very proudly doing so, and to introduce the concept that a Jew, that an Israeli athlete could make it to that level of competition. So the entirety of my equipment has been devoted to promoting this idea. So the new suit which I've designed, actually it's based on the old suit which I designed. So I headed to Park City, as I mentioned, in November of last year, completely unprepared. And when I say completely unprepared, I had nothing ready to go for the competition that was going to take place a week after the driver's school, or immediately actually proceeding after the driver's school. So one of the people who organized the competition in Park City, my first competition that I competed in, noticed that I had grabbed off the shelf a blue sweater vest and had taken a magic marker and had drawn an Israeli star onto it and had shown up to training in Under Armour pants. And she mentioned that I'd better as hell not show up to the competition in the next few days looking like that. It looked, quite frankly, a little ridiculous. So I knew that I had to get something which looked professional, which was professional, and which helped me compete at a level which would at the elite level. So I got in touch with a speed skating manufacturing company, a speed skating suit manufacturing company, and got them to manufacture a design which I had made, which incorporated the Star of David on the back of the suit, the Israeli flag on the front of the suit, and then Israel in both Hebrew and English on the legs. And that would be a prominent display when people were to look at me running, because they'd be able to see Israel in both Hebrew and English, the flag, and from the backside they'd be able to see the star. I've taken it a step further this year to implement my actual nickname, which is the Hebrew Hammer, but also to incorporate the seal of the State of Israel, that menorah seal as well. And there is space that has been left for people to help sponsor my journey, because this sport is highly expensive. It's very specialized, and all of the costs are borne by myself. So there has been attention paid to leaving space if people should wish to sponsor the team.
All right, again, as I mentioned, this is the Ari Louis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. My guest is AJ Edelman. We're talking about Israel Skeleton Racing and new suits, a design that AJ's come up with, and also some of his training. And this training is to set you up for a big year for you. You have 8 competitions coming up, World Championships in Australia, also Europe. You're going to compete in Europe for the first time. Any nervousness about that at all? You know, I'll be honest, I've only been in Europe once. As a Jew, I don't feel comfortable being there. I'll just being honest. What are your thoughts?
I'd say the proudest thing for me about representing Israel in sport is the ability to show up at any given place and present Israel and the Jewish people in a positive light. And so we know that Europe has not been the friendliest in the recent past towards our particular community, but it's something that I'm actually looking forward to being able to perhaps change in some subtle way. Europe is something which is exciting for me. It's a new frontier in sport for me, and the season is going to be a huge season. It's going to be, as you mentioned, 8 competitions, about 15 to 16 different races, up from the 4 that I hit last year, and all of this is supposed to culminate in the World Championships in Austria come February. The entirety of the season is going to be devoted towards setting up the Olympic qualifying year in a couple of years, and that would take place because next year we're trying to make the World Cup. And the point system grants the most points to World Cup qualification. And so this year, the reason I'm hitting 8 different competitions, or 8 different competitions in 16 different races, is because we're looking to make sure that Israel is qualified for the World Cup in the coming year.
All right, and that is certainly a big pressure, a lot on your shoulders. Nervous at all about these events coming up?
Not. It's tricky. It's always something to look forward to when you're going to experience something completely new, but at the same time, there is an expectation that I have for myself. There's an expectation that others have for me as well, rightfully so, that I'm going to represent our country very proudly, and I'm going to perform at the level for which we'd want me to perform. So obviously there is some pressure, but it's something which, coming from a background in high-performance sport previously, something that I'm used to and something which I'm actually looking forward to.
All right, so again, some big events coming up for AJ Edelman. There are competitions, 8 this year for him, again, competing in Australia, Europe, and Lake Placid. That's an interesting one for you because that's the first time basically you had a race, correct?
Not the first time I had a race. Actually, Lake Placid was where I got my start in skeleton. Back in October of 2013, I had messaged the U.S. program to get involved with the sports of skeleton and bobsled, and was invited from hundreds of participants to the training school in Lake Placid at the Olympic Training Center. And that is where I first got my exposure to skeleton, and fell in love with it after the first run. So it holds a very special place a very special place in my heart from a sporting perspective. But aside from that, it's just another one of these tracks. I'm actually much more my anticipation level is much higher for the upcoming competitions in Whistler and Vancouver, which is going to be a definite first for me.
Now, some of the things we've talked about in the past is this sport, like other sports, has a danger element to it. Obviously, people can get seriously injured, and one of the things you're going to compete on in Whistler, Vancouver, that's the fastest track on the tour, 90 miles an hour. You're going to be there 4 times in November. Are you at all scared? We talked about you being nervous enough. Are you scared at all about potential injuries?
I'm I'm not scared. I'm more aware. The issue of competing in Vancouver as at the Whistler Sliding Center is something which has been presented to me before in the 2014-15 season. If I had competed there, I would have qualified for the World Championships. But I was told by a number of athletes that it would be most advisable to not compete there as an absolute beginner. Vancouver is a tricky track. It's the fastest track on the tour, and it is known for causing difficulties in the form of injury for a number of sliders. People might remember that in 2010, a luge athlete flew out of the track and died. The track is the fastest on the tour. You will go over 90 miles an hour in some portions of it, and it's something for which I am aware of that there is a risk of injury. But as in all high-performance sports, you have to take the plunge at some point, and so that plunge is going to come in the form of 4 straight races in November.
All right, so it's just one of those things where you just put it out of your mind, because if you think about it, it's not going to help you anyway, right?
If you think about injury before you go down a run, you are in serious trouble.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's kind of like radiating. You know, if you're going to create all these negative thoughts, it's more likely to happen than if you don't think about it. You make the preparations, but outside of that, then you just got to focus on the race, right?
From what I've heard, the absolute best sliders in the world have a completely blank mind before going down the track and don't have to think about it. They can just grab their sled and go. I think at a place like Whistler, if you are actually thinking, you're already reactionary, and at 90 miles an hour, you can't react quick enough to save yourself from anything from which you might get into. And so my number one goal in preparing for Whistler is to be as confident as possible that nothing will happen, so that I can go down with a completely clear mind. If I am thinking about injury, it's likely that I will injure myself.
Again, this is the Ari Louis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. My guest is AJ Edelman. We're talking about Israel Skeleton Racing. AJ has 8 competitions coming up, including World Championships. He'll be in Europe and Lake Placid, and has done a lot of training in regard to that. And some of the training you had was pretty interesting as far as what you ate. You apparently had an application that set you up to figure out what to eat and keep track of what you were eating?
Right. So before I joined the sport of skeleton, I had competed previously in collegiate hockey, and towards the end of that career, I decided that I would like to shoot for some new goals. One of those was in the form of competing in natural bodybuilding. And natural bodybuilding demands a lot of you from a nutrition standpoint, because you can train as much as you want, but if you don't eat correctly and don't fuel yourself correctly, you're just not going to get the results that you need. And so for a full year, or for more than a full year, I walked around with a pocket scale in my pocket, made in Japan. I bought it in Japan, and I walked around with it in my pocket. Nothing that went into my body was unmeasured. Nothing was unweighed, to the point where in Japan, if I went to a sushi restaurant, I would dissect at least 3 of the pieces of sushi to see just how much fish was inside each one, just how much rice was inside each one, and then to extrapolate that out to the 40 other pieces that I would be eating. Every day in Japan, I'd eat about 10 raw eggs and 45 or more pieces of sushi. And so it was just one of those things for which I had to know exactly what was going inside my body. And for a full year, everything was tracked on an app called MyFitnessPal. And MyFitnessPal is available to everybody if they want. It's in the Apple Store. It's in the Google Play Store. It's something for which I highly recommend people to use, but obviously not going overboard on it. Measuring everything that you eat is kind of nuts, especially when it comes to Shabbos. I do recall the difficulty my mother would have when I'd go home for Shabbos and insist on weighing all the pieces of chicken before they were put on the hot plate. That caused a bit of problems and a little bit of friction.
But you did this for how long? Did you weigh and measure how much you were eating and put in the application?
I did this for over a year straight. I have more than 365 days of every single thing that was put inside my mouth.
Wow. All right. And then what were the results from doing all that?
The results were were what I was going for. I was able to compete in a natural bodybuilding competition in the 2014 Annapolis Bodybuilding Championships a week before my graduation. I hit my goal of getting to 5% body fat. Everything was going swimmingly well. Unfortunately, I have not been able to replicate the lifestyle anymore as much as I'd want to do so. It's a very fun thing to do. It's a very challenging thing to do, which I think all high-performance athletes shoot for a personal challenge. But skeleton is much different. It demands a lot more aerodynamic consideration. You have to eat to perform on a power output that is much more demanding than I think bodybuilding is. And so I haven't been able to replicate that lifestyle anymore, nor will I really be able to over the course of my skeleton career. But after skeleton is done, let's say in 7 years, I do very much look forward to picking up that challenge once again.
Okay, but when your racing is over, your racing career, then you can just eat whatever you want, right?
I think the mentality of somebody who has competed in bodybuilding is that you never go back to eating whatever you want.
Wow.
It just doesn't happen.
So that's it. I mean, this is your lifestyle.
My lifestyle for years has been dictated by the sports that I play. I think many different people can relate when they become very passionate about something that it takes over their mentality. It takes over everything that they do. Nutrition and performance is something that is at the core of what I've been doing for many, many years, certainly growing up as a hockey player, and then especially through college, seeing exactly what kind of training and what kind of nutrition would get me through a season in the best way possible. And then bodybuilding just took it to a completely different level in that everything was so managed, everything was so structured. And I don't think that I'd be able to ever give that up. I'm very keen and very aware of whatever I'm putting in my body. Even on a day like today, I know that every meal is going to have 60 grams of protein. Every meal is going to have, let's say, 30 grams of carbohydrates, and then an appropriate and healthy amount of fats to fuel me through my workouts through the day. When I'm traveling, of which I travel an excessive amount relative to normal people, I know exactly what I'm packing with me. I plan it for the week. I bring it with me. I can cook it I can cook a week's worth of food and bring it in my backpack. It just, I don't think every athlete plans as much as I might plan for my lifestyle, because they are very comfortable with the lifestyle that they've grown up in. But I think once you're exposed to that manner of preparation, then it's just not something that you could easily give up, especially when you've found success with it. And everybody has found success in the sport with their own ways of doing things. Some people are very keen on drinking beer, for instance. I despise beer. I find it to be a very bitter drink, but most of all, I find it to be something which won't fuel me effectively. And so it just becomes part of you.
Wow, all right. Well, there you go. Passion mixed in with training, and we have AJ Edelman. And before we let you go, you have a funny story regarding some kids who saw you. This is after the bodybuilding competition, so apparently they saw you. They were outside a temple. Pretty interesting story. Tell our audience about it.
Right. So I've spent the last 2 years in Japan getting to know the culture, working there. The last 2 summers in Japan, I should say. And I've always scheduled time to go and see the various sites which I could see, and one of those was a temple at the outskirts of Tokyo. And this was very soon after I'd graduated school, so only about 2 weeks out of the bodybuilding competition. I was looking a little, I'd say much more vascular than the average Japanese individual, and certainly a lot bigger. And so I was wearing one of these shirts that they'd given out at career fair at MIT, and it was a little form-fitting. And so these kids kind of spotted me, and they started to I wouldn't say, they came up and tried to flex in front of me, and kind of just, I think, a little surprised at the sight. I'm not huge, but in Japan, this is probably a bit of a rare sight for them. So these kids who had absolutely no mass on them, who couldn't have been older than 11 or 12 years old, lined up in front of me to flex and take pictures. And so, I have a number of these pictures of me just sitting at a temple flexing with a bunch of these little kids. It looks quite frankly ridiculous, but it's one of the cutest things that I can recall from my time in Japan. It brings you I think it brings you another awareness of as an athlete you are different than a lot of the people who you interact with, and you're not always aware of it because you're spending time with a lot of other athletes who are better than you, quite frankly. The Australian athlete John Farrow, who I will be with in the coming months, is an exceptional slider and an exceptional athlete. And so, being in that world, it causes you to forget a little bit just how different you might be in your mannerisms or in your preparations or in your appearance than some of the other people. And so that moment for me was kind of it was a bit of a funny moment.
Funny moment, kind of the realization that you got a quasi-celebrity thing going on, right?
For these kids, it was, I'm absolutely no celebrity, but for these kids, it was something for which they just probably had never seen. They just hadn't been exposed to it. Being on the outskirts of Tokyo, they probably had never seen somebody who was A, maybe as white as me, B, maybe as tall as me, and C, maybe as broad as myself. So it was, it just makes you aware of the differences that you might encounter when traveling abroad.
All right, there you go. Again, this has been another episode of the Ari Louis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. My guest has been AJ Edelman talking about Israel Skeleton Racing. AJ, if anyone out there wants to get in contact with you or they want to support you, sponsor you, whatever, how should they go about doing that?
Right, so I have a website, israelskeleton.com. It's actually very simple to remember because my sport is skeleton. I represent Israel. So, and if anybody wants to email me, it's AJ, that's my name, at israelskeleton.com. Sponsorships are always very much welcome, very much encouraged. As I mentioned, this season is an excessively expensive one from the standpoint of sports. It'll be probably in the realm of $40,000 this season, and all the costs are borne by myself. Anybody wishing to get in touch with me for sponsorships, just to give their support, or words of encouragement, are definitely encouraged to visit the site, use the contact form, or directly email me, aj@israelskeleton.com. The other way in which you could support the Olympic dream is by liking and sharing the Facebook page. The Facebook page is facebook.com/IsraelSkeletonAJ, or looking me up on Twitter or Instagram at IsraelSkeleton. It's always nice to hear from people. I've heard from a number of people who have reached out from the website that I've met on planes, that I've given my cards to, and they're all very excited to learn of the journey that is taking place. Everybody has seen the Cool Runnings, or many people have seen the Cool Runnings movie, which is based on the 1988 adventures of the Jamaican bobsled team. And so there's always comparisons drawn that a small desert country could potentially compete in the Winter Olympics, and that's something for which I'm very proud of. And I feel that many people can connect to it. And so if anybody has any words of encouragement, just wants to get in touch, ask any questions, see how they can get involved in the sport itself as well, feel free to email me. Feel free to drop by the website.
Okay, great. And again, that's AJ Edelman. Anyone out there listening, if you want to support this show, you can do so through my PayPal account, which is israelsportsradio@yahoo.com. AJ, thanks for being my guest today. Great job, and appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. This is the Ari Louis Show on Israel Sports and News Radio. Have a great day, and shalom from Israel.